When people hear Middle East war, they picture maps, missiles, oil fields, maybe a convoy of ships moving through a narrow strip of water. But in the United States, wars like this often land somewhere else first. In corporate fuel budgets, in freight invoices, in airline pricing desks, in the quiet panic of companies that know one regional fire can turn into a national cost shock very fast. And that is what makes this story dangerous. Because a war can stay far away on the map and still arrive early in the American economy. Not through politics first, through cost. Before we go further, tell me where you're watching from and what time it is where you are. And if you want coverage that shows how foreign wars turn into U.S. economic pain, subscribe and stay with us. When a Middle East war reaches the Strait of Hormuz, it stops being a regional story very quickly. That waterway is one of the most important energy choke points in the world. A huge share of global oil moves through it. So once conflict makes that route feel riskier, the market does not wait for a total shutdown. It starts pricing fear. That is when the meter starts running. Insurers raise war risk costs. Ship owners hesitate. Carriers reroute or slow down. Airlines and logistics firms start rebuilding fuel and scheduling assumptions around danger, not normality. And once energy movement and market psychology all start tightening at the same time, some industries feel war in hours, not months. The first U.S. industry hit is almost always energy. Not because every barrel goes straight into the United States, because oil is priced inside one global market. Once that market believes a major artery is under threat, crude moves first, then diesel, then jet fuel, then gasoline, and that pushes cost pressure into the real economy long before most families can explain what changed. That is why energy feels war in hours, not weeks. Refiners start recalculating. Fuel distributors start watching margins tighten. Trucking and shipping companies brace for higher diesel. Gas stations begin repricing. A war in the Middle East may look like missiles on television. In the United States, it can begin as a price shock on a roadside sign. But fuel swallow is only the first layer of the hit. The second U.S. industry hit is airlines and travel. Because once oil spikes, the pain does not stay in refineries or commodity markets. It goes straight into jet fuel. And jet fuel is one of the costs airlines cannot talk their way around. When fuel turns violent, airline math changes fast. Routes get repriced, cheap seats disappear, schedules get trimmed, margins come under pressure. And that is why travel feels war so personally. A conflict far away becomes a pricier ticket, a harder booking decision, a route that no longer makes economic sense. The traveler may never study oil markets. That does not matter. They still feel it when the fare jumps. And behind the ticket price is an even bigger transport story. The third U.S. industry hit is shipping and logistics. Because once war pushes risk into a major maritime corridor, cargo does not just become more expensive to insure, it becomes harder to move, harder to schedule, harder to trust. And shipping cost is never just a shipping cost. It becomes a freight surcharge, a delayed delivery, a rerouted vessel, a warehouse shortfall, a container arriving late to the wrong place. So when Hormuz risk rises, U.S. companies do not wait for shelves to go empty. They start paying more to move fuel parts, inputs, and finished goods. And once that happens, the war leaves the map and enters the supply chain. The damage may start at sea, but in America, it shows up in slower deliveries, tighter inventories, and higher costs. Almost everywhere, goods still have to move. And that is when war leaves the port and enters the factory. The fourth U.S. industry hit is manufacturing. Not because factories react first, because they inherit every shock that came before them. Higher oil raises transport and operating costs. More expensive shipping slows parts and materials. And once that pressure reaches the plant floor, the war stops looking like a foreign crisis and starts looking like a cost problem inside American production lines. That is what makes manufacturing such a dangerous second-wave casualty. It is buying metals, components, packaging, freight time, energy. And when those inputs get pricier and less predictable, factories do what businesses always do under pressure. They delay expansion, slow hiring, protect margins, pass part of the pain forward. That is how a war in the Middle East starts reaching American workers who may never touch a barrel of oil or set foot on a ship. It reaches them through production costs, job caution, and the growing fear that the next order will cost more to make than the last one did. And the fifth industry may be the one families notice last but fear the most. The fifth U.S. industry hit is insurance and finance. Families usually notice it later than gas or airfare. But once it moves, the pain spreads faster, because insurance does not just price danger, it transmits danger. A pricier policy becomes a pricier voyage. A pricier voyage becomes a pricier cargo bill. And once lenders, underwriters, brokers, and traders all start charging for fear at the same time, the war stops living only in oil charts or shipping lanes. It starts getting baked into contracts, margins, and risk premiums across the economy. Finance reacts the same way. Markets reprice inflation risk. Bond yields shift. Rate expectations get harder to read. Business confidence gets more fragile. And that is the part families notice last but may fear most. Because once insurance and finance react, the shock is no longer trapped inside one industry. It starts leaking into borrowing costs, hiring confidence valuations, and the broader mood of the economy. This is why one industry gets hit in hours while another feels it weeks later. Energy moves first because traders reprice fear immediately. Insurance and finance move almost as fast because risk can change in a single trading day. Then comes the second wave. Airlines feel it as fuel surges and fares adjust. Shipping and logistics feel it as insurance jumps, routes tighten, and schedules slip. Then comes the slower damage. Manufacturing absorbs pricier inputs, delayed parts, and weaker planning confidence. Hiring cools. Expansion gets delayed. Workers who never touch oil or shipping begin feeling the conflict through overtime orders and job caution. By then, this is no longer a five-industry story. By the time the damage reaches workers, it no longer looks like a foreign war. It looks like a slower hiring plan, a smaller paycheck in real terms, a trip that gets canceled, a grocery run that feels heavier than it did a month ago. That is why this is no longer just a five-industry story. An airline worker can feel it through route cuts. A factory worker can feel it through pricier inputs and slower expansion. A warehouse, trucking, or retail worker can feel it through tighter margins and weaker demand. And even people far from those sectors can still get hit through transport costs, household strain, and the quiet fear that the job market may turn more cautious if energy stays high. And if the war lasts, five industries will not be the end of the damage. In the end, that is what this story really reveals. A Middle East war does not have to reach the United States through troops or headlines alone. It can arrive through five doors first: energy, airlines, shipping, manufacturing, and then the industry many families notice last but fear the most: insurance and finance. That is why the phrase foreign war can be misleading. Once fuel jumps, airlines cut or reprice. Once shipping risk rises, freight slows and costs climb. Once factories inherit pricier inputs and delayed parts, caution reaches hiring and production. And once insurers and markets start charging for fear, the pain spreads beyond one sector and into the wider economy. What began as a regional war starts showing up in American life as a pricier tank, a costlier ticket, a delayed order, a tighter budget, and a job market that feels less certain than it did before. So the final truth is not complicated. The war may be far away. The bill may not be. What this ultimately means is simple and a little unsettling. Most people think war first hits soldiers, presidents, or maps, but in a tightly connected economy, war often hits families through prices, schedules, and fear long before it ever feels military. That is the real lesson here. A distant conflict becomes domestic the moment it changes what people pay to drive, fly, ship, build, insure, and borrow. And once that happens, nobody gets to call it someone else's problem anymore. That is why stories like this matter. Not because they are dramatic on television, because they expose how fragile normal life can become when energy routes, trade corridors, and financial risk all start shaking at once. Americans may never stand near the battlefield, but they can still feel it in the cost of living, in the pace of hiring, and in the quiet loss of certainty that tomorrow will cost about what today did. Tell me where you're watching from and what time it is where you are right now. And if you want more coverage that shows how global conflict turns into real consequences for American jobs, prices, and daily life, subscribe and stay with us.